Yes, we're going to have the conversation, and I'm going to leave it with a man in the able hands of Charles, who is going to shepherd us through this conversation. So, Charles, this is your panel. We will end at 12:15 exactly, and so you have to. I'll help you manage the time. Don't worry, and so that we end exactly at that time. Charles, thank you very much.
Evans, thanks a lot for the quick intro. Like you heard, my name is Charles Wangoro. I work with the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. I'm the coordinator there. I'm very happy to be here for the 4th year running. So Evans has seen my face, like you said, and I'm very familiar. Today we have a distinguished panel with us. I don't want to spend too much time introducing each and every one of them. We have Ika Langele, from the director of Friends of Lake Turkana. Ikal is a grassroots activist with an interest in environmental justice. We have Kaisa Toroskainen, a native of Finland, but currently hosted here in Ghana. And we have Godba. Godba, I must say, has one of the most diverse profiles of our panelists today. Godba is a farmer, a social entrepreneur, a lawyer, and a policy analyst. When you put all of those together, I think you'd find that Godba has been in very many institutions doing a lot of great work along the continent. For my panel today, I want to start fast with Kaiser, who will come and share some key findings from some of the research that they've undertaken on local content. For those of you who don't have the program in front of you, this is a panel on what is the CSO's role in local content. So Kaiser, please.
Hello? Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this esteemed panel. As mentioned, I want to kind of start with sharing some early findings that we have been working on at NRGI related to subcontracting in oil, gas, and mining projects. And what I mean by subcontracting is procurement overall, so the international and the local, and sort of situating some of our conversations around local content and especially local procurement in that context. Sorry, yes. And I would be sharing some examples that we have found throughout this research around how civil society organizations can monitor subcontracting processes and promote local content in this context. So what do we mean by subcontracting? The context of modern petroleum operations and projects really today is such that the company nominated as the operator of an oil block or oil field doesn't necessarily end up doing all the work, the operational activities itself. In fact, they can outsource between 50 and 90% of activities to external suppliers, and these activities range from core activities like drilling and infrastructure provision to various supporting activities. The reasons for this are varied, from cost-cutting pressures and the technical expertise that is needed, especially in deep sea and offshore exploration and production. And this context has really given a rise to a very important group of technically highly advanced oilfield service companies and engineering companies. And these companies are also very important players in terms of local procurement, but they have perhaps been a little bit less involved in the conversations around local content so far. I'll give you an example. For example, from a lot of research on local content, we know that the development and construction stage of a project is where the largest investments are being made and when the largest need for employment takes place. But often this is a stage of the project that is outsourced to an engineering, procurement, and construction EPC company. And that company is actually in charge of procuring those goods and services. Often these EPC contracts are structured as so-called turnkey contracts, which means that this contractor would assume all the risk of any delays and cost overruns in the project. So this means that that company doesn't necessarily have a huge incentive to procure from local companies that are less known to them, that may carry some risks that they don't know from before, and they also might not have incentives to invest in supplier development. These construction projects and service contracts are also more short-term, so depending on the country and the laws, these service providers might not need to register in the country, and therefore they might not be obliged to deliver the same level of local content or some other provisions as well. So in this context, there's an example from Cameroon where a group of civil society organizations were monitoring local content implementation in a mining project in this case. And they found that even though construction capabilities were available in the Cameroonian construction sector, none of those companies were used in the construction of the mining camp. And when making these observations, this group was able to then also develop some recommendations around how those categories could be better taken into account in Cameroon's mining local content laws, and also around monitoring and evaluation. And subsequently, these recommendations were taken into account in Cameroon's mining law when it was revised. So their monitoring activities by civil society can have such a feedback loop to optimizing local content policies. But to do this, civil society organizations need access to some critical pieces of information, such as the business plans, local content strategies, and also data on actual procurement. And this is from those upstream companies, but also from the big service contractors, so that they can analyze the procurement that they do. There are a few other sort of structural issues related to the context of subcontracting. I think we touched on them quite well, relating to certain incentives, for example, around tax or import duty exemptions that might favor imports, foreign imports over local ones. So I won't spend too much time on that, but I would just encourage that to be one area for civil society to look at in each country. To what extent is the whole policy mix from fiscal incentives to the local content rules really in line, and does it support those local content objectives? The second is around cost monitoring and cost inflation risks. We had a brilliant presentation on cost auditing yesterday, so I won't spend more time on that either, but just to mention that there's an explicit link to subcontracting, because if we say 50 to 90% of spend is spent with suppliers, that basically means that 50 to 90% of the material that those cost auditors are going through are actually supplier invoices. So really knowing how to audit them is very important, and there are particular risks related to when subcontractor parties are related, but also in cases where cost inflation might be because of there are disguised undue improper payments. In Indonesia at the moment, the oil and gas regulator is investigating into around $300 million of inflated costs, which they suspect at least part of it is because of corruption. So that's actually the area that I want to conclude with. As part of the research that we've been doing at NRGI, we've looked at 41 cases prosecuted in the oil and gas sector under the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and 31 of them included subcontractors in one way or another. The most common way is that it includes an international and a local subcontractor. In some cases, just improper influence in the selection of the contractor led to awarding the contract to a less qualified and more costly contractor, which of course is depriving other suppliers from the opportunities to participate in the sector. But then in some of the cases also local content rules specifically and explicitly were used to push companies to contract with businesses that have links with politicians or politically exposed persons. Now, yesterday as well, it was highlighted by the Deputy Minister and others how much progress Ghana has made and other countries have made around open contracting in the award of the upstream licenses. And in the context that I've just outlined, corruption risks existing in subcontracting and those contracts being much more frequent, thousands of them being awarded every year, and less visible, so harder to monitor. I would ask what kinds of principles of open contracting we could apply also in the award of subcontracting so that civil society and other oversight actors could monitor these processes more effectively. Some of the areas that are critical in this regard are the whole process of tendering, from procurement plans to issues of those tender notices, as well as the results of who got the contract and also who did not get the contracts. There are several examples that I have, but I think I have sort of exceeded my time, so I will hope to come back to those in the discussion and hand over to the next one. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Kaisa, for everything. Just a quick follow-up, on that question. You've spoken a lot about the civil society role, and including sort of politically exposed persons. But does civil society have access to information to play their role? You spoke about, for example, cost audits. I know in Kenya, for example, there doesn't seem to be a clear route towards publication of that audit. So, is civil society sort of tied in terms of playing their role if they don't have access to this information? Or in your study, was there, did civil society have enough information to enable them play their role?
Thank you. Yes, well, I think yesterday we heard about specifically around the cost audit reports that those are frequently not published, so that's one part of the problem. But no, overall, I would say these subcontracts, procurement contracts, have traditionally been regarded as contracts between private parties, so they haven't been in the discussion of open contracting as much, and therefore there's relatively little information out there about them. So, but this is starting to change slowly. For example, in Nigeria, the Nigerian Content Management and Monitoring Board is now publishing the list of pre-qualified suppliers, which has actually enabled the industry groups in Nigeria to monitor to what extent local content is actually happening in Nigeria. Another area where there's quite a lot of progress recently is these beneficial ownership registers. They're being developed around the continent and around the world. And when they are specific to the extractive sectors, it would be really important for this kind of monitoring for them to include subcontractors as well, so that civil society can use that information, but also governments, regulators, and companies can use that information when they are screening for suppliers. And then the last area that I would mention is where this idea of these contracts being between private parties is actually not applicable, is when national oil companies are making these purchases. Lots of research has shown that they are really important players in nurturing local businesses and building capacities and therefore developing local content, but their procurement processes can also be abused and vulnerable. We've seen in Brazil what happened with Petrobras, so it would be very important for national oil companies and state-owned enterprises to practice transparency and competitive bidding. In Mexico, there's a very interesting example whereby Pemex, the national oil company, can appoint something called social witnesses to supervise the whole tender process, and those witnesses would sit in the tender committee and have access to all the information so that they can actually monitor impartiality and due process. So these are some of the examples where we're making some progress. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Ikal, to bring you in, you're civil society, you're working in the area, having to engage with communities, trying to negotiate with companies, including even on issues around local content opportunities. What's your experience so far, and what do you see as a civil society role broadly?
Thank you. As Charles said initially, I'm grassroots. So we are the people who are pushing away from the typical local content to local, and further on to local. Because in my country, there is devolution. So there's national, and then there is Turkana, the county where the oil is, and then there's the Lokichar Basin where the oil is really coming from. So there's 3 levels of local content. So local content at the national level, local at the county level, and then local at the very village level. And so sometimes we are seen to be anti the national development and the regional conversations, but that is the reality of what is happening in our continent. For some reason, resources are found in the most marginalized places in the continent. And it becomes very hard for those marginalized places to compete equally with the national spaces. I come from an area where you have recent statistics, 79% poverty level. We have an almost 80% illiteracy level. So when we think about local content in terms of employment, it is likely that the local community will have unskilled and semi-skilled labor. So it has pushed us as civil society to live and work and advocate within that reality, that the opportunities for this local community where the costs of extraction hit most is least likely to be meaningful. In terms of what Charles was saying, what we've been advocating for, what we've seen is that the input, so the main company there is Tullow Oil. Sometimes there's a rush to bring in, you sort of say, we need eggs, and we are looking for a supplier to provide eggs. Unfortunately, the rush, because everybody thinks it is our turn to eat. There is the book of This Is My Time to Eat that was written by one of our own. And so this has been seen as, this is our turn to reap. We are a very arid area, so they say the oil is our turn to reap. And unfortunately, because of that rush, everybody runs to start producing eggs. And so every women's group has come together to produce eggs. And all of a sudden, there's too many eggs. Or if you have tried to produce eggs, I think in the northern part of Ghana, or any north hot area, you notice that fresh eggs don't last too long. They get spoiled in such a short period of time. So you have all these eggs, all these women producing eggs, because somebody said, we want women to produce eggs. And everybody's producing eggs. So we are stuck with too many egg producers, with a bad road. So even if they produce for an external market, by the time they move it from their production to the market, they're all broken. So those are the realities we're living with. Then the other side we're seeing is an extreme increase of brokerage. Because because we want a local company. Yesterday people said sometimes the indigenous becomes you front. And so there's a push. Recently, the subcontracted companies said we will give 30% of the, so we have two, for the early oil pilot scheme, we'll give 30% of the opportunities to local companies. And this I always laugh, because my villagers, whenever you say, we will give you to give us a tipper, I have gone there and I said, no, I don't even want you to give me a tipper. Please, as a village, supply me 2 bicycles. They don't even know where to start, because it is so out there for them. These are herdsmen who know how to operate in their ecosystem, and all of a sudden you're telling them, provide a tipper, do you have a company? And this is something that people throw at communities. You as the community will supply us with this. This community does not even have a community company. So the brokerage firms come in and really play communities, because now it is the elite who's the smartest in the room, who can know which company they can bring in, and they say, we as the community. But when the money is given to that broker, there is no way it trickles down to the village. So we say local content because a local company was given the opportunity. Last year, I think Talo said, we have spent $12 million on local content. And when you really look at it, the village where everybody says the oil is, right now, one of the shopkeepers said, sometimes it is hard to make 30 shillings out of it. So the local content doesn't leave beyond a few contracts here and there. All the operations happen within a camp. And the minister didn't say it yesterday, and we were laughing one day and said, if the people went out and were able to buy a drink, were able to sleep in a lodge outside the camp, at least it would trickle down. But the current setup of the oil operations is you fly in to the airfield that is closest to the operations, so everything is in the operation. So as long as you cannot supply to the operations in the camp, there is nothing that gets out to the communities. And we keep saying local content. These people, even the local people working in the oil company, get out of the camp, get on the flight, and go to Nairobi, because the policies within the oil company do not allow them to take public transport outside. Because the company will say, if you don't give me, the next person will give me. And those are the sort of things we are noticing more and more, and trying to push for transparency within the local content development plan, the training aspects, but also pushing our government to invest. We realize that our governments keep saying the company should provide local content, but then it is a cost to us. And one of the things that we've started to really push for is, what is the cost of pushing for local content, the first thing, but also what is who monitors? The people were talking, as she was mentioning yesterday's discussion on auditing costs recovery is going on sitting in Nairobi, but then there is no auditor who has come to the ground to quantify what actually was done. So a classroom is built, it is in the books, but what is the value of the classroom, or even to question it? So you find us taking mixing local content and CSR as one thing. If you look at the CSR report for Talo, it mentions local content. So all these things it's a blurred area where local content, CSR, what are the costs, and just really trying to push for further input into these real partnerships in ensuring that local content. But yesterday evening, Charles also mentioned the planning aspects. As a country, we don't see the bigger plan. We have a Vision 2030, but all these local content development plans do not link to that Vision 2030. So we're just talking about local content in a silo of the oil sector, but in our reality, this oil will get finished in 30 years. Then what? And that's really the question that we as civil society are asking.
Thanks, Ikal. I think you raised some very critical points, especially around sort of how the sector is an enclave sector, and basically, does company policy even support local content? Amongst very many other things, including fronting. I want to go straight into Godba, because Godba is a farmer and a social entrepreneur. Godba, should these CSOs let you supply your farm output to the companies and stop disturbing you instead of talking about local content?
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles and colleagues, and good morning, everybody. I basically want to make about 4 specific points reflecting on the topic. One is a point that really relates to a lot of the discussions here, and essentially my observation that local content is not is mainly a function of planning and strategy, and less a function of legislation. Because there is always a tendency on this continent that countries run to enact laws. And I think that coming from Uganda, I would argue that if laws were a solution to most of these things, including local content, Uganda would probably be moving close to cruising altitude. Because we are very, very good at making these laws, and they are very good laws, very specific commitments. So I want us to really understand that when we talk about a realization of local content, we are talking about the capacity of the state to plan, the capacity of the state to strategize, or to draw strategies and implement them. And I think there are two, from my perspective, there are two major areas of preparedness that countries must be able to invest in. The first one is education preparedness. What is the quality of your labor force as a country? Before you even talk of local content, do you have a labor force that can easily be mobilized to be able to skill so that you can deploy those skills in the different areas of interest? And I'll give you an example that in Uganda, for example, a World Bank study in 2010 essentially found that the quality of the labor force in Uganda would reach the quality of the labor force in Ghana of 2010. Uganda will reach that target in 2030. So, because I think in 2010, the quality of the labor force in Ghana was about 60% of the labor force had completed secondary education. But Uganda is projected to reach that level in 2030. Yes. Actually, Uganda's projection in terms of its labor force is that it is projected to reach 48% by 2030. So that is about a period of 20 years. Malaysia achieved the same transition in terms of labor force within a period of 10 years. And remember that Ghana's projections for labor force improvement by 2030 is 80%. Now, if you are looking at countries that are prepared, you are going to appreciate that Ghana is more prepared to be able to take advantage of the petroleum and gas subsector than Uganda. So that's about the quality of the labor force. The second level of preparedness is the ease of doing business. And quite a number of people from yesterday talked about this. But what is the ease of doing business in the respective countries where petroleum is being developed and produced? Again, some statistics from the 2018 ease of doing business report. In East Africa, Rwanda improved its ranking from number 41 to 29. It was the best performing of all of the 5 countries of the East African community. Kenya improved from 80 to 61, and it had the biggest jump in terms of improvement. Uganda regressed from 127, regressed to 127 from its previous position of 122. Tanzania dropped to 144 from the previous position of 137. Burundi was at 168. And of course, South Sudan was at 185. Remember that the total rankings in this ranking is 190 countries. So Sudan is 185. So these are the countries that we are dealing with. They are because Sudan, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, they are all either oil-producing countries or potential oil-producing countries. So you have a challenge there that you are dealing with. Again, if you compare with Ghana here, you realize that for the 2018, Ghana's ranking improved from 120 to 114. So these countries have different levels of preparedness. And I think unless we are able to deal with those conditions, I mean, we can have all these kinds of discussions, but I don't think that we can make as much progress as we can do, whether civil society tries to do so many things that we do or not. The second point that I want to raise, which may sound controversial, is that international oil companies are not charitable organizations. These are not driven by philanthropy. They are not driven by feelings. Their business is to make money. Yeah, and I think if anybody starts complaining and say Taro is not doing this, Sinuk is not doing this, we are basically running off from our responsibilities, because the other are businesses. For us, we are governments trying to make sure that people benefit from our resources. And therefore, we must be conscious of that. And therefore, whether a country is able to develop local content really it's going to be dependent on how it is organized, the quality of the public service, the quality of the institutions, that they have the capacity to engage with these companies, but most importantly, to prepare the populations to be able to benefit. My third point is about what civil society is able to do in this kind of environment. I want to start off from the point of view that, yes, we have the legislation. Because what does the law do? I think one of the participants said earlier that the local content legislation is different from the rest of other pieces of legislation that we know. And I tend to agree with Madam who said that. Because local content legislation will normally help you set the scope of local content, but more importantly, set the targets. And remember that those targets are targets for countries to enforce. They are not targets for companies to comply with. It is the responsibility of the government to make sure that those targets are met. But local content legislation also create accountability responsibilities, accountability and reporting responsibilities. That's really what is important about local content legislation. As far as civil society organizations are concerned, I would say, and this is part of what has been the most organizations have been doing, advocacy on policy and legislation in countries where there is no law. And you know, it's even surprising that you find civil society organizations raising money, trying to push governments to put in place policy and legislation. You ask yourself, but why does government have to be pushed to do what is obvious? The second role is one of monitoring implementation of commitments. Yeah, that given the different priorities, civil society organizations can actually help in monitoring implementation of commitments. The third point, which is about mobilization of citizens to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that have been created. And then, finally, civil society organizations can also help in managing the politics of implementation of legislation on local content. But in doing this, civil society organizations in most of the countries are actually challenged by the nature of the funding that they have. Because all these NGOs that you see, because in most of our countries we don't have well-developed think tanks like ASEP and others. You are dealing with fairly fragile small NGOs. They are underfunded, they are undermanned, and they are very short-termist. And the work that you need to do here is more strategic and long-term. So my last point is more about governance and political leadership. And these to me matter. I was here for the last summit. So from that summit and now, I am so struck at the way we are either deliberately shying away or oblivious of the importance of political leadership and governance. I don't know if it's the deliberate design of the summit, but I think that's something that we don't pay attention to in these summits. But you think about that most of these countries that we are talking about are in a governance crisis. Yeah, and I can, because it's very, I think it's fulfilling to have this conversation in Ghana, because Ghana, you guys, you must congratulate yourselves because you've really made progress. No, you need to. But think of the countries, and I'll just give these examples and shut up. One is that in Uganda, this is my country where I come from, our President Museveni has been in power for 33 years and has changed the constitution twice to stay in power. And we actually think that the discovery of oil may be one of the incentives why he doesn't want to leave. In Angola, it took the departure of Dos Santos for Angola to start feeling a breath of fresh air. In Gabon, the president is reported missing. I don't know if anybody here knows where he is. In Equatorial Guinea, the president is guarded by some mercenary force from another country. And in South Sudan, we have two gentlemen, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, who have specialized in signing and breaking agreements. Now, you all look at a package of all these countries and then you see, then we come and talk about local content. I think that these countries have a lot of preoccupation. Yeah? Yeah. I think they are preoccupied with so many things that we don't seem to talk about, and yet they are so important if we are really going to take advantage of these resources. And I want to propose to ASEP that the next summit needs to talk about more of the governance than just the technical aspects of these resources, because local content and all the other stuff, I have worked with a number of people in technical agencies of government across the continent, and I know how smart and committed they are. But it is the governance and the political leadership that is holding this country back, because when all these guys meet, they basically meet as a club of comrades rather than leaders that are focused on transforming their countries. I want to beg to stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Godber. I think you're what they describe as a moderator's nightmare. So I'll try and bring back the conversation by starting off with a question, actually. Trying to link the governance challenges that we have within the continent and local content. And I'll have the panelists sort of have a quick response to it in terms of, isn't the role of civil society then to try and step in that space? If you say local content in of itself is a good thing, that citizens of a country should benefit from opportunities that arise in their sector, in their oil and gas sector, shouldn't civil society then step in and prevent politically positioned people from accessing these opportunities that should actually be going to local communities, and like Ikal said, local communities? Is that a role of civil society to step in and try and address some of those governance challenges by trying to put a spotlight on these issues? I'll start with Ikal and we can work down.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think one of the things, in terms of civil society, we ourselves, so Emmanuel was complaining that we've been called politicians and all this. I think the one thing, before local content, what was the word? We keep changing the terminologies and making them very hard for day-to-day citizens to deal with. We have free, prior, informed consent, and we use very technical words. But if you look at it, free, prior, informed consent is nothing new. Before you get married in the African culture, you actually give full consent. So in every marriage, every home, every community, free, prior, informed consent is known. So like local content, we have to, if we are going to really shift the power, because the whole concept of governance is shifting power to the people. Because we, civil society, will move from one role to the other, we'll move from one organization to the other, we will change into government and back into civil society, and the cycle goes round. And so to answer the governance question, we have to start to see how do we really shift power to the people? And how do we break down these big words like local content, subcontracting, and all these things to be understood by the people? Because subcontracting, even with the farms, if you have a farm and your brother comes and says, can I plant for this year or for 2 seasons, it is subcontracting. And we have to start to break that down so that day-to-day citizens who are not in this enclave economy and in this enclave space understand this. Because they are the best people who can hold governments to account. They are the ones who vote every day. They are the ones who have public hearings with their representatives. I think that for me is where the back will stop. Because yes, if we civil society start to take that knowledge that we have and break it down instead of being knowledge brokers within our communities, within our countries, we will really start to shift it and then be able to understand what am I holding my government to account. If you look at public budgeting in our countries, citizens have become part of it because they were able to understand. I was fortunate enough, because I sit on the ASAP board, I was fortunate enough when Ben, before he became the executive director, included me in a campaign, the one that moved oil for agriculture from I think 1% to about 9 to 11%. And that, if you looked at it, it was run by small-scale farmers. Peasant farmers is what they were saying. And because they understood the relationship between the money from the oil and the agriculture, and because, you know, the land issues, the things that they dealt with. And until we do that, and that's why you're seeing public budgeting in our countries, in our communities, has become a conversation that citizens can engage with a little bit more than what we're talking about when we talk about oil revenues. And it is because we have been able to, over time, break that public budgeting to people to see it as schools, education, healthcare, water, very, very day-to-day things that they interact with. But when you go to a village and you're talking about subcontracting, this is a farmer who's thinking about their arrowroots and their yams. How are they supposed to think about subcontracting? I think that is going to be very critical in terms of how best we push this governance question, because we have to take the language and break it down for day-to-day citizens to be able to engage with it and hold their leadership to account.
Fantastic. I want to open up to more questions now, because we're sort of quickly running out of time, and I really want to engage the audience in this slightly controversial panel. I see 2 hands. I will start with Jamal. I believe that's your name. I heard you from yesterday. Please keep your question nice and short.
Okay, thank you very much. As you said, my name is Jamal. My question is about the organizations that we've been talking about, the civil society organization. I quite remember when I was growing up in Kumasi, remember Rotary came in Kumasi and they said, we've discovered oil in Ghana, so they are going to train these local people. They are going to train these local people to fill the certain gaps that we have over there. But quite unfortunate, I remember very well my brother was part of those people. They were asked to register. They paid money. They didn't see any training. And at the end of it, it's like it was a white elephant or whatever that we describe it. So how can the new society, or what we've been talking about today, win the trust of the people? Because if you come to Kumasi, for example, where I'm coming from, we are having, I think, 2 of the largest mechanical shops in Ghana. But at the end of it, the work that is coming there as a benefit to them from the oil companies because they are going to use automobiles. We think they will be servicing the automobiles. They are going to use welding and other stuff, and we think they are good and they have the experts to do those things. But at the end of the day, you ask them to go and form organization or whatever, and they can't win the contract. So how can we win the trust, number one? And how can you tell them or give them assurance that, yes, if you bring in the local content, you are bringing it to them? That's my question.
I have a question on the left.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Kisi, visually impaired, and I'm representing the Ghana Blind Union. My question to the SCOs is that we are all aware that the SCOs normally advocate for the neglected in the society. And as we are all discussing matters regarding local inclusiveness, and the idea of local content is to make sure that all the people in the society are included in whatever happens in their community. So this is a situation where persons with disabilities are part and parcel of the community. But in areas of employment, in areas of training, we all know what it takes to be part of it. And the discussion that we just had this morning, we realize that we all believe in